Between World War II and the 1960s, the Cotton South underwent a huge transformation. The arrival of new machines and chemicals meant that for the first time, cotton production could be almost entirely mechanized. And with mechanization came consolidation. Farming became the work of the relatively few large land-holding, highly capitalized farmers who could afford to keep going. This was a big deal because for over a century, growing cotton had required an enormous amount of human labor and thus lots of humans. And now that it didn't anymore, what would become of the sharecroppers, the tenant farmers, and contingent workers who had provided all that labor? Well, in the span of about 2 decades, from the 40s and the 1960s, most would be forced off the land, thrust unprepared and with few marketable skills into cities that had little use for them. What's more, even many small landowning farmers lost the ability to stay afloat in the new capital-intensive farm structure. They too left the land without much choice, and few would ever return. Historians have come to call this process the Southern Enclosure Movement. So, while the individual lives of the dispossessed and displaced are kind of hard to trace in the archives, in many ways numbers can tell the story. For instance, between the 1930s and 1960s, 9 out of 10 tenants and sharecroppers in Mississippi disappeared. But an 88.2% decline for that time period. The changes affected all poor and vulnerable farmers in Mississippi and across the South, but were most acutely felt in the Choctaw and Black communities. So more than 3/4 of Mississippi's non-white farmers of any tenure status, so from sharecropper up to landowning farmer, left the land during the same period. About a 77.6% decline. And as small farmers disappeared, big farmers got bigger. The average size of a Mississippi farm more than doubled, about 63 to about 162 acres. This is consolidation, right? So it makes sense. As small farmers disappear, their land gets folded into bigger farms and plantations, big farmers get bigger. By the way, I included the relevant numbers for Tift County in your handout, so if you're curious how this played out across the South and in the county you now live in, these figures are there. So now that said, none of what I've said so far is particularly new to historians of the South. For the past half century, scholars like Pete Daniel, Clyde Woods, Jack Temple Kirby, Gavin Wright, and others have written about the Southern Enclosure Movement, and I highly recommend their books. But as I dug deeper into this story, I started having questions that the existing literature didn't really answer. So, for instance, what does it mean that the economic rug was pulled out from under Black Southerners just as the Civil Rights Movement was achieving its greatest victories? What does it mean that this wasn't the first time that a large number of people had been more or less banished from the land in the South? Indeed, what should we make of what seems like a pattern of dispossession and mass displacement in the South, dating back to Indian rule? And finally, how should we deal with the fact that these are images of evicted tenants in the mid-20th century, just not in America? These pictures were taken in South Africa, a place with a strikingly similar history of dispossession, and as it turns out, parallel history of land enclosure. In fact, I began to see, as I dug deeper, that enclosure wasn't just a U.S. South phenomenon. It was a common thread across countries with similar histories of settler colonialism, which is a form of colonialism predicated on displacing and perhaps eventually replacing native populations on their own homelands. So what's new here? Well, those lingering questions turned into this book with its unimaginative title, Southern Enclosure. And in it, I use the interpretive frame of settler colonialism by sort of resituating and reframing the South as a settler society akin to South Africa or Zimbabwe or a dozen or so other places. I try to tell a much more expansive version of the enclosure story. And here I'll relate that story in 3 points: invasion, exploitation, and disposal. And by the way, in the book, I mainly look at a certain section of Mississippi, central Mississippi, about 9 counties in that part of the state, and I was fortunate to have a cartographer friend. Sometimes you just have cartographer friends who made me a quick map for this book. So his map is in there, it's right up there. Thanks, Chris Crenshaw. So invasion began in earnest in 1830 with the Indian Removal Act. Following that law's passage, the U.S. foisted the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek on the Choctaws of central Mississippi. And while it ultimately deported about 15,000 Choctaws, there was a provision in the treaty, Article 14, that allowed some to stay, provided they lived under the laws of the state of Mississippi and take the individual land allotments off of them. But settlers and speculators took advantage of lax government oversight, dispossessed the Article 14 claimants with impunity. In other words, they took treaty lands from Indians who were entitled to that land further through the Dancing Rabbit Creek. In many early cases, whites simply invaded the homes of Choctaws who had chosen not to leave, sometimes driving them away with whips, other times moving in while the Choctaws were out hunting or on some errand. Most Indians in Mississippi who remained were left landless and destitute. Choctaw leader Peter Pitchland returned to the area about a decade and a half later and reflected that this once was a healthy country, but it is now a very sickly one. And so changed that I scarcely know any of the places which were once familiar to me. The whole country is nearly under cultivation. Indeed, Choctaw's land base in Mississippi quickly evaporated, and toiling on settler farms was one of very few options for those electing to stay. As one Choctaw leader later recounted, landlord used him almost like a slave, but not quite. Having eliminated or subdued indigenous claimants to the land, ruling settlers now shifted their attention to labor control. As a result, by 1860, there were only a few thousand Choctaws left in Mississippi. Just the 9 counties of east central Mississippi, though, contained 47,169 slaves. In the state as a whole, there were over 430,000. So just a few thousand Choctaws left, pushed out of the way, replaced by tens of thousands, and on the state level, hundreds of thousands of slaves. Now, the end of chattel slavery in 1865 transformed labor relations, to be sure, although coercion remained nearly as indispensable a part of the new labor regime as the old. Now, I want to note here how occupation and labor exploitation kind of worked in tandem. The settler colonial violence and racial chauvinism that had in just a few short decades turned the Choctaws' land into what settlers called white man's country now underwrote a relentless drive to secure a rural proletariat of sorts and make the land pay. And for their part, as we'll see, Choctaws recognized land theft and labor exploitation as two sides of the same settler's colonial coin. Ruling whites reasserted labor control after Reconstruction was over, in part by using the law to forge a new system of land tenure that favored landowning planters. So stock laws, fence laws, and game laws made it nearly impossible for poor landless farmers and other people to survive outside the cotton economy. Lean prioritization laws ensured that planters and merchants got paid first at the end of the season. Anti-enticement and vagrancy laws further tied poor people to the land. A fact that non-white Mississippians had little power to change as they had been stripped of the vote by the 1890s. Neo-slavery was perhaps even worse, from peonage to convict leasing to outright kidnapping. Landowners found ways to quite literally re-enslave black, native, and some poor white people decades after emancipation. For instance, at the end of 1917, a Neshoba County man named Tom Stevens dictated a letter to Interior Secretary Frank Lane, describing how a white landowner named Vance Posey had, quote, robbed me of everything I had and beaten me nearly to death. Posey forced Stevens and his family to work for him without adequate provision to pay, flogging Stevens when he refused. At first blush, this case is really no different from a whole lot of others in the region, but because Tom Stevens was Choctaw, He had an unimpeded sense of how such exploitation fitted its sort of larger settler colonial arc. As Stevens attested, quote, "The white men, some of them, have treated the Choctaws this way all the time since the Dancing Rabbit Creek Treaty. Everything the Choctaws get, the white man take away. This is the way they drove our grandfathers from their homes, and now they take everything from us." And by the way, Stevens' letter is figure number 3 in your appendix contract. Tom Stevens viewed white landowners' ruthless labor control measures as a direct extension of colonial invasion. And his parting observation that this is the way they drove our grandfathers from their homes, and now they take everything from us. His parting observation makes clear that settler colonial dispossession was not a discrete event, but rather a structure and a process unfolding over time. Landless and politically powerless, Choctaws fell prey to the same sorts of exploitative measures that ensnared black Mississippians and poor whites as well. For Stevens, neo-slavery was all the more degrading for its occurrence on stolen Choctaw land, the taking of which was, of course, the conditioned possibility for the whole rotten system. More than half a century after emancipation, elite whites still felt a sense of ownership over their labor force, much as they did over their land. According to R.J. Enix, a white doctor and federal agent serving the Mississippi Choctaws in the 1920s, it was, quote, custom for landlords to keep indebted sharecroppers, quote, in captivity until they had paid in full. Race apparently mattered less than social class or tenure status. Quote, all the people who moved from place to place, the poor white people, the Indians, and the Negroes in this country were vulnerable to such abuse. Quote, it amounts to an unfortunate state, Enix told members of the Senate subcommittee of the Committee on Indian Affairs in 1930. Quote, but this is the custom which the landlords have amongst themselves. Soon, federal government intervention would change everything, form of remedial farm programs, subsidize those same landlords, paving the way for the final stage in our process. After World War II, white landowners began a concerted drive to quite literally be rid of the people they had heretofore depended on and exploited. A growing civil rights movement raised the specter of a catastrophic collapse in labor control. And in part to avoid such a calamity, the Southern agricultural establishment pushed to mechanize and consolidate. The architects of this shift really made no secret of their intentions. As you can see here, as one planter put it, Richard Hobson, quote, mechanized farming will require only a fraction of the amount of labor which is required by the sharecrop system, thereby tending to equalize the white and Negro population, which would automatically make our racial problem easier to handle. And put it a whole lot simpler than that. They hope to solve their, quote, race problem with a shift to capital-intensive farming. By design, the transition would virtually eliminate tenant farming and sharecropping and lead to the consolidation of land in fewer, wealthier, and in most cases, whiter hands. This meant that in time, the prosperous descendants of the pioneering settlers would come to enjoy an ever larger share of the spoils of colonization. While the century following Indian removal had witnessed the exploitation of black, native, and some poor white people as laborers on taken land, the post-war period gave rise to an entirely new set of social relations, wherein laborers were rendered disposable. Mississippi Extension economist H.J. Putnam outlined in an unpublished 1946 report how displacement was literally built into the new farm structure of the state, suggesting that displacing tenants and small farmers would make life easier for larger operators. He argued that, quote, the disappearance of farm families from Mississippi farms should not be looked upon with regret, but with extreme satisfaction. The Extension Services test demonstration program, for whom he wrote that report, thereafter deemed farms with tenants and sharecroppers to be troublesome, quote, problem farms. For large landowners to prosper, it seemed most others would have to disappear. The Farmers Home Administration, or FHA, whose mandate actually included helping struggling farmers, also got in on the action. In February 1957, a white Kemper County woman named Inez Gunn informed her friend, U.S. Senator John Stennis, that the FHA was trying to take land from two of her black neighbors. These two men right here, J.Y. Mosley and Turner Mosley. Senator Stennis, who actually knew the brothers personally, took the unusual for him step of pressuring state and county FHA personnel to relent and help them solve the problem. Yet the incident demonstrated just how easy it would have been for two people without the Mosley brothers' connections to be forced off the land. And there can be no doubt that plenty of people whose names we'll never know were similarly banished from the land by similar means. Mississippi Choctaws had an especially hard time remaining on the land in the era of the Southern enclosure. Their displacement was actually in line with the Bureau of Indian Affairs goal of terminating the trust relationship between government and tribes, relocating Indians from reservations to towns and cities where they might be sort of mainstreamed into settler society, detribalized, and what have you. This was known as the policy of termination. Indeed, plenty of Mississippi Choctaws were forced to leave the state, whether to pick vegetables in Florida, sharecropping in Tennessee, or work in factories up in the Midwest, in places like Cleveland, Chicago, Minneapolis. And at the time, this meant slow but certain detribalization for them, as their constitution then said that if a baby is born outside of Mississippi, that baby is not technically Choctaw. With the 1960s, came the push for substantive civil rights legislation, as well as an intense conservative backlash. Hardcore reactionaries, from unreconstructed bumpkins to U.S. senators, proposed ways to not only oppose civil rights, but to literally rid the South of much of its non-white population, now seen as superfluous to just about everything in the wake of mechanization and consolidation. For instance, a Mississippi group called Americans for the Preservation of the White Race discussed ways to, quote, make white people raise rents until blacks are forced to move away. Of course, we will do it gradually so that their loss will not affect our economy. White citizens' councils, all across the state and all across the South, first sponsored so-called reverse freedom rides, in which they would pay the way of black would-be migrants to northern cities, notably Hyannisport, Massachusetts, home of President Kennedy. Then, by turns, the Citizens Council supported a separate African-American state somewhere else, and endorsed Louisiana Senator Russell Long's proposed African repatriation bill. Our own Georgia Senator Richard Russell famously proposed a racial relocation plan that would forcibly move large numbers of black Southerners to other parts of the country, recalling the Indian Removal Act of more than a century before. Author James Baldwin noted that parallel in an appearance on the Dick Cavett Show in the mid-1960s, where he lamented that, quote, there is nothing in the evidence offered by the Book of the American Republic which allows me to really argue with the cat that says to me, they needed us to pick the cotton, and now they don't need us anymore. Now they don't need us, they're going to kill us all off, just like they did the Indians. Now, Baldwin's observation to us might seem hyperbolic in retrospect, but black Southerners had real reason to fear for their future in the South. In fact, there was already mass migration underway, a second great migration source. As ex-tenants and ex-sharecroppers made their way to northern and western cities in search of factory work. However, a combination of discrimination, plant relocation, and automation placed many desirable production line jobs off limits to them. Few of them, after all, had any marketable skills or experience in their urban environment. Too late, observers would note the southern roots of the urban crisis, as uprooted rural Southerners became disgruntled slum dwellers, and in many well-known instances rose up and rebelled against the toxic combination of grinding poverty and police brutality. Back in the South, empty tenant shacks evoked the abandoned Choctaw cabins of the previous century. When journalists like Robert Sherrill and Hottie Carter III visited Mississippi farms in the latter part of the decade, they encountered the remaining victims of the Southern enclosure, ex-tenants and ex-sharecroppers who, after mechanization, had been more or less thrown away by their former landlords. And, these people had once been indispensable to the whole process. But now they were, quote, as useless as a mule, and, quote, dead wood, hardly worth keeping alive. The poverty in Mississippi in the mid to late 1960s was staggering. A team of doctors visited a smattering of Mississippi counties in 1967 and reported scenes of outright starvation, in addition to untreated tooth decay, severe and chronic diarrhea, ear, eye, and bone diseases, and more in just about every county they visited. Nor were enclosure and its attendant effects just U.S. Southern affairs. Settler states elsewhere, Southern and Eastern Africa especially, Kenya, Zimbabwe, South Africa, each experienced versions of this process. In South Africa, a group called the Surplus People Project would later outline in an exhaustive 5-volume report how a similar combination of capitalization, mechanization, chemicalization, and enclosure between the 50s and the 70s had led to wave after wave after wave of forced migration from the land. In a country, by the way, where a wildly disproportionate share of the land was in the hands of a tiny white settler population who was increasingly unwilling to depend on their political enemies for labor when they didn't have to anymore. So, a key part of my argument tonight has been that this most recent wave of expulsion, whether it's in Mississippi or South Africa, entailed a sort of redeployment of the tools of empire, coercion, land theft, displacement, for use against the multiracial agrarian working class. The elite descendants of well-heeled settlers presided over what historian Walter Johnson has called the, quote, generalization of tactics pioneered in empire and slavery, now absorbed in race-neutral form into general practice. It should be unsurprising that more than half a century later, miserable poverty in Mississippi, as in other settler states like South Africa and Zimbabwe, threatens to overshadow movements for civil rights and self-determination. I would argue that what we truly have is a colonization problem. Now, I don't want to end on that note. So I wanted to tell you real quickly, in just a few seconds, that other people had different ideas along the way. In the 1930s and 1940s, there were people imagining different futures than the one that we got. And there's nothing to say that we can't turn right back around and study those people, what they had to say to us, and embrace their ideas, and make a new future for ourselves that isn't like this. So, any questions? Yeah.
What role would you characterize the Agricultural Adjustment Administration as having in the start of this?
Yeah, they were distributing payments to the Agricultural Adjustment Administration was a New Deal farm program. They did a lot of things. Distributed payments to farmers for bringing the crop prices up to parity. So farmers would get a parity payment. And they would also get a rental payment from the AAA to basically not plant. The problem in the 1930s was farmers were planting too much. The government had to pay them not to plant as much anymore, so the government gave them 2 checks. And at least one of those checks was supposed to be split amongst the sharecroppers and tenants as well, not just kept by the landowner. And in most cases, the AAA handed that check over to the landowner, trusted that it would be split, or knew that it wouldn't, and didn't care to make sure it got split up. And so the AAA, in effect, subsidized a lot of the early mechanization that would obsolesce the labor of sharecroppers and tenant farmers. It also held AAA committees and not in court. So the records of disputes over any number of things that people might have gotten into arguments about on farms are now done in front of just the AAA committees themselves and kept by the AAA committees themselves. And so we, in some cases, we don't even have access to them as historians working in archives. We're just sort of in the dark. Other questions?
I do have another one.
Yeah.
Well, it is weird. How would you characterize the role of post-World War II demobilization as accelerating this or exacerbating it or what?
So the chicken or egg issue of did off migration, out migration respond to mechanization, or did mechanization respond to out migration? I think, and it seems that the literature has landed on the notion that mechanization happened first during the war initially, and then the mechanization of cotton picking, the mechanical cotton picker itself, just after the war, obsolesced the labor, and then the critical mass of out migrants left at that point. So I'd say this flood of ex-soldiers and servicemen and defense workers temporarily went back to farms and then found that their labor was not needed anymore, so they had to then leave again. And that's what we see in the numbers. We look at the ag censuses, 1945, 1950, 1954. You see a little spike there before you see the drastic decline in sharecroppers and others. So that's my take on it. I mean, one or two historians would dispute that, but other questions, concerns? Yeah.
So then I'm thinking that three-part process: invade, exploit, and dispose, and thinking about all kinds of instances of that occurring, ancient up to ongoing, current, and local. And I'm just wondering if you have any examples, kind of other examples that you haven't written a book about, but something about where a similar kind of pattern is kind of easy to see, and if maybe it's different when the immigration factor is not part of it, like Appalachia or Okies going to California, that sort of thing.
Yeah, Stephen Hahn has written plenty of great work on the arrival of capitalist relations in places like the Hill Country, northern Alabama, Georgia, where race wasn't as much of a factor, certainly sort of a factor. But I mean, in a real sense, I think that what you have here is elite landowners versus vulnerable non-landowning farmers and small farmers. And it's not to say that in this case race doesn't factor in at all. That's not what I'm saying. But in other situations where race isn't a factor, I can imagine. I haven't looked outside of the 20th century very much, the 19th and 20th centuries at this issue. But I can imagine there were similar dynamics there. I mean, this book gets its title from an essay from back in the 80s that referred back to the English enclosure movements of the 15, 16, 1700s, which was a different context. Race was not really a factor there at all, but it was elites sort of rationalizing and closing their operations, forcing people off the land that they had once exploited, disposing of them, as it were, on the streets of wherever, Bristol, London. And those ended up being a lot of the actual people that participated in the settler colonial invasion of the Americas. Yeah. One sort of feeds off of another in that sense. Yeah. Yeah.
What piqued your interest with the state of Mississippi and why did you choose the state of Mississippi?
So I didn't have a dissertation topic for a little while. For a little bit too long, I kind of didn't have a dissertation topic, and I was just hopelessly overambitious as far as what I could write a dissertation on. This book, by the way, evolved out of a PhD dissertation. So I sat down with one of my mentors at one point in the process and kind of confessed to him that I was really, really behind in the process of selecting a topic, in the sense that I sort of didn't have a topic. And so we said, all right, like, we know what we want to talk about, which is U.S. empire, invasion, colonization, things like that. What's a small chunk of, place and time that you can look at and sort of investigate those dynamics and not be rewriting the whole history of the world? And so I thought, all right, that's a good way to approach that. So where do I know that all of these themes, Southern history, empire, civil rights, voluntary labor, indigeneity, all of that sort of overlap? One of those was East Central Mississippi, where you have the history of slavery and Jim Crow, but you also have a living history of people overcoming settler colonization. So that and it's also within driving distance. About 9 or 10 hours away, so it's not horrible.
Yeah, I got another one.
Yep.
Shut up. Was there any effort to convert from cotton to some other agricultural pursuit, like truck gardening or grain farming?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in East Central Mississippi, let's see if I have a picture. Well, you don't really get a sense of it there. East Central Mississippi, if you don't know, it's not the Delta, right? The Delta is the more famous part of Mississippi on the west side of the state. Usual, really rich soil, very flat as far as the eye can see, right? That's not East Central Mississippi. East Central Mississippi is red clay hills, and it's not what you typically imagine as cotton country, So when this transformation is happening, you're right. I mean, there are other suggestions coming from extension agents and whatnot that were saying, well, if we're going to mechanize the cotton production process, maybe it's best not to drive some of this heavy machinery on the steep sides of red clay hills. Either terrace your farms or get into some other business, right? Like start growing something, or maybe convert to dairy. That was a big deal, right? Beef, dairy. People are starting to do tree farming at this point too. So responsible silviculture is becoming a thing. And if you notice, none of those, dairy and beef, harvesting trees, none of that requires very much hand labor, not compared to cotton farming. So whether they mechanize and continue to farm cotton exclusively, or whether they mix in one of these other, truck gardening or beef or dairy or something, at the end of the day, you're using less labor. For a lot of people, that was the point. Either they didn't want to pay them, or they didn't want to see them anymore, or they didn't want to deal with civil rights. Other questions?
The exploitation, did you kind of find any stories or evidence about the way in which the land use was exploitative and how it led to kind of less renewable, sustainable kind of use of that land?
Yeah. Not as much in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, but in the 1930s, some of the new, really visionary New Deal folks that are traveling across the South with Henry Wallace and just some of the other kind of progressive-minded, Rexford Tugwell, guys like that, are looking at what's going on sharecropper farms, especially in tenant farms, where there aren't the resources to farm in a very, very responsible way. And they're saying, good gracious, look, this is a social disaster, it's also kind of an ecological disaster. Not that it can be helped in the current system, but they're noticing that in the 1930s, and they're writing about it, and it comes out in several reports. But by the time we were post-World War II, the guys calling the shots are the, Delta cotton people, the big wigs in the cotton industry, and they are, the Delta Council was a group of large landholding, mainly Delta dwelling people, and there was not a whole lot of appetite for what you and I might consider responsible land husbandry. It was just make the land pay fast, because if you're dealing now 1940s, it was being rayon and other synthetic fabrics, and cotton was, at least the picture they're painting is cotton was trouble. So they're trying to look at the bottom line in every way they can. So yeah, I mean, that was a huge concern for me. It's like, wow, like, not only are we not farming super responsibly, but now we're adopting all these machines that rely on, fossil fuels and they burn gas. It's a big deal, but not that kind.
And fertilizer runs into the water course.
Yeah, exactly. Pre and post emergent herbicides, all that stuff. Not so good. But again, not really thinking about it. Yes. Other questions? Sir. Going once? Going twice. Oh, Russell.
Yeah, kind of like to build on, I know it's like all fast question. You mentioned like the very end of your talk about, alternatives and things like that, and just now you brought up Tugwell and Wallace, and I wonder if you could kind of like draw back a little bit to talk a little bit more about, what could have been, right? Kind of this moment in communities where maybe some of this history might have gone in a different direction.
Yeah, and so the Resettlement Administration is one government agency. When you start talking about the 1930s, it's one government agency after the other, so bear with me, but I mean, it's, for a nerd like me, that's super exciting. Resettlement Administration, for one, Rex Tugwell's organization, was literally the business of resettling struggling farmers on workable, farms. Whether that was near where they were before or not, setting up, model towns and farm villages and things like that. The Subsistence Homestead Division was in the business of taking people who, thought that they could spend part of their work week, working in town, but weren't making quite enough money in, whatever mill or factory they were working in. So the Subsistence Homestead Division, allowed them to move on to land that would basically serve as a garden homestead type situation. They could grow all their food and still work in town part of the week, And these, it was one of those up in Monticello, Georgia. Jasper County had a major subsistence homestead operation going on. The Resettlement Administration had projects in, where'd you used to live? Gulf Brown? Irwin County. Irwinville. Grady County had one. You may not know it anymore because it's almost been 100 years, but these projects were all over the state. One over in West Georgia, right? But over time, the political will to sustain those was gone, and the war happened, and we abandoned that. But again, we could just as easily turn back to that sort of land ethic. I think we should. And just, I guess the last thing on that would be the idea in the 1950s and 60s under Ezra Taft Benson's, USDA was bigger is better, get bigger, get out. Big farmers survive, little farmers die, and move off the land. And that's just how it is, and that's how we're doing it. And that was in the water for 30 some odd years after World War II. And not a whole lot of people could fight against that sort of mentality. But there are alternatives, and there are smaller scale alternatives to look at. The 1930s sort of shows that. So that's, spoiler alert, that's like my next project is to investigate something happy and sort of hopeful, because this was Other questions? Earl Butts, get bigger, get out. Yeah. Yeah, Wendell just rails against Earl Butts. Good for Wendell.
And now it's all farms and chicken farms.
Yeah. We've got to clean up our act, folks. We can do it. We're at Act School. Let's do it, tomorrow.